So the topic of this video presentation is why does insulin make belly fat? And it is being produced through the Atlanta TMD Institute. My name is Dr. Mark Allen Podolsky. The Institute is here to educate dental and medical professionals in TMD to develop knowledge of temporomandibular disorders and to successfully treat patients suffering with TMD or temporomandibular disorders. And you may say, isn't it crazy that you're talking about belly fat when you're talking about headache and jaw joint problems and neck problems and breathing problems? Why are you doing this? Well, this video and this whole series of videos on diet are going to answer a lot of questions for many TMD patients who are suffering and give a opportunity for these people to learn things that so that they can change their diets, lose weight, decrease their fatty tongues, decrease their fatty necks, decrease their fatty bellies, and survive well, sleep well, do better. So we are reaching out way beyond the jaw joints in order to solve problems that may make TMD patients sicker. So just to start, because we're getting into specific information, we start with a medical disclaimer. All content in this video and all information, including but not limited to text, graphics, images, and other material contained in this video are for informational purposes only. Different patients respond differently to different things, so that the information presented is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice and should not be relied on as health or specific personal advice for you. Dr. Mark Allen Podolsky is not a physician and not a dietitian. He commonly refers patients to these other healthcare professionals when patients wish to be supervised. Always seek the guidance of your physician or other qualified healthcare professional with any questions you have regarding your health or medical condition. Never disregard the advice of a medical professional or delay in seeking medical advice because of something you've watched in this video. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your physician, go to the nearest hospital emergency department, or call the emergency services immediately. If you choose to rely on any information presented in this video, you do so solely at your own risk. Dr. Podolsky does not recommend or endorse any specific tests, physicians, products, procedures, opinions, or other information that may be mentioned in this video. Reliance on any information appearing in this video is solely at your own risk. So often, people will call and they'll want advice, or they'll email and they want advice. And we got to be careful because over my 40 years of practice, I have diagnosed several cancers, several brain tumors, other things. And when you call me, it could be something really terrible, but you're thinking it's a TMD problem. So I have to be very careful when I start talking about dietary things and other things that typically help TMD patients. I have not diagnosed you as a TMD patient. And if you come in, which you're welcome to do, that's a different story. But again, I have to say, I'm not a physician, so I cannot make a medical diagnosis technically. I can get a preliminary diagnosis and send it to a physician for confirmation. Absolutely, we do this every single day. I've diagnosed diabetes and I don't know how many people, thyroid problems, and I don't know how many people, but it was always confirmed later and treated by a physician where it's supposed to be treated. So again, thank you for looking at the video. I'm just so happy that you're watching it, and hopefully this video will change your life. So the subject of this video is why does the hormone insulin make belly fat? Now we know that insulin does this. And there's, Mother Nature's smart, God's smart. There's always a reason that helps your survival. There's a reason that the body does things, and almost always the body does things in order to help. And when somehow the body gets mixed up and doesn't understand the situation it's in, that's when we get difficulties, and that's when we start getting problems with the body. And insulin, this whole topic is going to basically review the fact that insulin helps you survive. Insulin keeps energy available. It's like a bank account, right? You're putting money into a bank account, a CD, and everything's there for you at times of need. And that's what insulin does. Insulin's a very, very powerful hormone. It the hormone insulin's job is to keep you alive, both in good times, also in bad times. During the good times, insulin forces your body to store energy away in fat cells for later use. People don't like fat. They look at fat and it's just something they don't desire. But fat is stored energy. Fat is your bank account for life. It is supposedly there so that you will survive later. During the bad times, you use this stored energy when there's no food around. It's only recently in mankind's history that we haven't had severe shortages and famines. And there's a whole history throughout, if you look at our history, of huge famines and people dying off. And the people that stored fat did better than people that did not store fat. So this phenomenon, or this thing where when you eat, you make fat easily, that used to be a good thing because you would survive better. And we forget that in ancient times, like prior to agriculture, which was about 10,000 years ago, we were hunters and gatherers. We hunted, we moved around continually. You kind of think of the Indians and the American Indians, their lifestyle. And in ancient times, people who did not store fat that died when there was no food around, when there was a famine. Famine, we don't see famines here in the United States or in Europe, right? And there's always food everywhere. It's amazing. I think if my great-grandfather came back from the dead and went into a food store, a supermarket, super means big, right? Supermarket, and saw all the food, he'd probably just break down. He wouldn't be able to deal with it. There's just a huge amount of food right now. But it was very important when you were hunting and you were able to find food that you would eat that food, right? And then keep the food available by making fat. So the food would be that you eat today would be available to you in 6 months or a year through the storage of fat. So people who stored belly fat had a better chance of surviving and making it through the hard times. So eating a lot during the good times and making fat helped during the bad times when there was no food. So let's just think about this. People who had big bellies with lots and lots of stored fat, stored food away for bad times, they lived, they survived, they continued to exist, right? So what does that mean? Then they had children. And there we pass down traits, certain things that we have to our children. They have very similar genetics, or they have very similar genetics. And so they also had insulin hyper means too much, activity, meaning, geez Louise, so much insulin was secreted into the blood that fat was put away all over the place. So these survivors, they had children and they passed along this trait of insulin hyperactivity and excess of fat storage to their kids. And their kids had this trait, and they had kids, and their kids also had insulin hyperactivity with excessive fat storage. And they all survived well during bad times, so they continue making more and more kids, right? So this is how it works. So people with big bellies then had children with insulin hyperactivity, just like you. Your ancestors were survivors. Your ancestors were tough cookies. They survived through the hard times because of their big bellies. So I have a big belly and I have insulin hypersensitivity and prediabetes and it's so frustrating. It really is. But then I look at the positive side with, how my ancestors survived. And I often kid around with thin patients who come in and tell them My ancestors really did well during the cold food-reduced winters and during times of drought, while your ancestors died. And we see this beautiful winter wonderland underneath here, which now today we have special clothes, we have automobiles moving back and forth, we got heated houses, while our ancestors did not have any of that. This was a difficult climate to survive in. You had to hunt and kill and get fur, and you had to find food during the winter. Where are you going to find food at winter? I always make a bad joke and say that like my ancestors then made babies because they survived with your dead ancestors' mates. They died, their mates are still there, we're surviving, we make children. And this is why I am here. I'm here because I have the trait of hyperinsulinism, hyperinsulin activity, and my ancestors survived only to make more children with that same trait. We are in a time in history of complete abundance. We have so much food, and it's overwhelming. And you can see in this British farm, there's two very large silos, and this is a small farm. And so one farm can raise quite a bit of food. And when you consider all the farms and plus the large agricultural companies, there's just food everywhere. So when we compare the bad times in ancient times when we didn't have food, we're not in that time. So, however, with modern agriculture and food distribution, there are never any food shortages in first world countries. We can go to the grocery store in the winter, right? We couldn't do that in that cold climate we saw previously. It wasn't there. And now we've built these food distribution growing systems so we can go to the grocery store in the winter and get what we need, even after we stored fat for the winter time. So we stored all of this fat for the wintertime coming up because we knew we weren't going to have very much food. Except during these times, guess what? All that stored fat stays there, and we continue to store fat because we can go to the food store and get lots more food when our ancestors had cycles of plenty of food and not so much food. Put fat away, lose fat. So we can't lose the fat because there are no shortages during the winters. And that's what the problem is. You see, we have a body that's used to plenty of food, not so much food, plenty of food, not so much food, and putting it into a culture, a situation in modern times where there's food around everywhere. And there really is too much food for the human body. So why is it good for insulin to specifically store fat around the organs? Your internal means inside, organs means all little powerhouses that do different things, like factory. It's a factory inside there. So when you live in a very cold climate, my ancestors lived in Belarus, Austria, Ireland, all cold climates. So when you live in a cold climate, having lots of belly fat to protect and warm your internal organs is a good thing, right? So fat is stored energy. Yes, so we can survive. But wait a minute, it's also an insulator, right? It keeps you warm, keeps the heat inside. It's like a fur coat, right? So fat does a lot of good stuff, doesn't it? And we don't really think of it like that. Today, we see it as evil. We spend thousands and not thousands, we spend billions and trillions of dollars trying to lose weight, and we don't like this fat. But the fat was really, really good in ancient times. So what are internal organs? Internal organs, like the liver and kidney, are the manufacturing and detoxifying power plants in your body. So if you're going to choose where to put the fat, keep it away from the arms and the legs so you can walk and do things, and keep it around nice, warm, toasty power plants inside your body. So again, when you see belly fat, it's warming internal organs and helping you stay alive, but it also indicates insulin hyperactivity, right? Increased insulin blood levels. So when you're making too much insulin and it's going into your blood and it causes you to make lots and lots of fat, where does the fat go? It goes into the internal organs, basically around your belly. So you can see these people walking along in the street. It's easy to recognize them. Insulin grows a big belly that causes you to look like an apple, right? So you got apple is thick in the middle and thinner at the top and the bottom. Got it? A big belly with an apple shape is almost always a person with elevated blood insulin. It's a telltale sign. A sign is something you can see, like a stop sign. Stop sign doesn't talk to you, but you know when you see that red stop sign, you have to stop. Well, guess what? You know when you see someone with a huge belly with internal organ fat storage, that this is probably almost always an elevated blood insulin person with pre-diabetes, metabolic syndrome, or diabetes. This is a problem, isn't it? And it used to be beneficial, but it's not beneficial anymore. So as I stated before, when blood insulin, the hormone goes high, insulin prefers that you store fat around the internal organs, around your belly. And what's one of the main organs? The liver. Therefore, you also see high rates of fatty liver in patients with high insulin blood levels. So what is fatty liver? It means that fat gets inside the liver, right? And wait a minute. The liver is not a belly. The liver is not supposed to be a fat storage organ. There's not supposed to be any fat, or hardly any fat inside the liver. But then all this liver, all the fat grows inside the liver and kind of blocks everything out and strangulates the liver. And that creates a lot of problems, right? Increased what we call insulin resistance. That means your insulin doesn't work anymore. Oh, Lord Almighty. Then you get diabetes. Then you get atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, and heart attacks. Whoa. So fatty liver, bad. Healthy liver, good, right? So when you see these big fat bellies, that often is a sign this person is going to be in trouble, right? This person is going to have probably insulin resistance and probably going to have later have diabetes and may even die from a heart attack. So fatty liver in patients with therefore you also see high rates of fatty liver in patients with high insulin blood levels. The fat stuffed, literally you're stuffing it, like they're in France, they get gooses and they force feed food down the gooses so that they grow so big and their livers get fat so that they can have, pate of duck, and we don't want to force feed a human being, right, to get fatty liver. The fat stuffed into your liver cells usually causes liver problems, and that's a big problem because the liver is such an important organ. It detoxifies things. It keeps you healthy. That liver is so important. Now, one of the things that we learn is that diabetes progresses over 5 different stages, beginning in early childhood very often. And one of the first things is fatty liver. When the fatty liver starts not functioning correctly, you start seeing elevated or increased levels of certain what they call enzymes from the liver. So one of the first signs is elevated liver enzymes. These are enzymes that are seen only in the liver, especially elevated alanine transaminase, ALT, and aspartate transaminase, AST. This will be discussed more extensively in the medical testing section later in this book. But it is so interesting because throughout my life, no kidding, whenever I was younger, they would do blood tests and the physician would say, actually, I don't know why these enzymes are high, but it seems to be no big deal. And little did they know that was the beginning of fatty liver, and these elevated enzymes indicated that there were too many enzymes being made, and they spilled out into the blood. There was so much that it couldn't stay in the liver. There was too much of these enzymes being made in the liver, so much so that it blew up the liver, and you started seeing these enzymes in the blood, and they are liver enzymes. And I had them much throughout my life. And this is something that is very important. You have to understand that physicians are usually very good people, but that doesn't mean that they keep up with all the literature. That also doesn't mean that they're experts in every little area, right? And they could look at you and see you're fairly healthy, and but yet see these first signs of disease and not recognize that they're very early signs, and it may take 20, 30 years before you get sick. But the best time to treat it is when you're young, isn't it? So the potato famine in Ireland, where many Irish left, there's actually less Irish in Ireland now than there were prior to the potato famine. So the potato famine in Ireland could have been completely avoided if the British sent excessive wheat to Ireland, but they didn't. Unfortunately, the philosophy that the British adhered to was, well, let the market do what it does. They felt that the Irishmen should work things out themselves and grow other crops and do things to compensate in order to um, let the system work itself out by itself. But that didn't work, did it? Today, however, there's plenty. There's plenty of food, plenty of water. I mean, you can go anywhere and turn on a tap and get water, and it's generally free, right? Water everywhere. Plenty of food, plenty of water, plenty of shelter. Famine is no longer a constant fear. Yet, that's how God nature developed our body to deal with these fearful situations, which over the last million years were there all the time. And it really is only the past maybe 10,000 years that we've really started making lots of food. And when you really get down to it, maybe the past 100 or 200 years where there's plenty of food, maybe even 100 years where there's plenty of food for everybody everywhere. Um, Most foods today are really cheap. However, the cheapest foods the cheapest foods are exceedingly high in carbohydrates. This is very important. Those are the things that we tend to eat more, like bread, pasta, potato, rice, right? These are things that are very high in carbohydrates and they tend to be cheap. So you eat the brands of food that are cheap and your carbohydrates are basically sugar in a different form. And when you eat cheap, high carbohydrates, you increase your blood sugar when everything dissolves. Therefore, you increase your insulin. Therefore, you start storing belly fat. Therefore, you get a fatty liver. Therefore, you get inflammation and arteriosclerosis. Bad things happen to good people. And this is a very, very important concept. However, the cheapest foods are exceedingly high in carbohydrates. These carbohydrates spike and raise blood sugar and blood insulin, which then triggers fat production beyond the human body's ability to store it. Now, why are there fats in your blood, triglycerides in your blood? Because the fat cells can't store it any longer. There's too much and it's busting out into the blood. So when you see fat in the blood, it means that all the cells are full of fat and they can't store much anymore. So we eat the cheap carbohydrates because they're cheap and there's plenty of it. And the government says it's okay. It's a huge part of the food pyramid. And what happens? We grow fat. And we ask ourselves then, then we ask ourselves, why are we growing fat? Well, excuse me? You're eating lots of carbohydrates that our ancestors never had available. Carbohydrates that are not natural. Carbohydrates that are man-made, man-processed. And it's so crazy. And that's why a lot of my TMD patients are sick. So there's one thing contributes to another, contributes to another. So they have joint inflammation that's caused by excess of insulin from excessive carbohydrates. Then they have ache everywhere throughout their whole body because the inflammation is generalized everywhere. Then they can't breathe because their tongue gets so fat that it blocks out the throat and you can't sleep. Their neck gets fat because the fat goes into the neck and then you can't breathe. And so these people have breathing problems and TMD problems. And you look at their eyes, and they're all swollen and puffy and dark. You can see it in their bellies and in their faces. So we need to get TMD patients healthy. We need to get people healthy in general, because this is going to be a huge problem in the future. And, our government's just not ready to handle this type of problem. They're just not, right? And there's so much corruption in terms of payoffs to food manufacturers that it's going to be hard to change the system to make our diet healthy for people. It's going to be extremely hard. So you have to deal with your problem and make yourself healthy, and maybe, God willing, you will get out and be active. But honestly, it takes decades to change a system, to change a government, to change a way of eating, right? But it's all this high carbohydrate diet's been a failure, and that's why we're seeing so many sick people. Thanks for watching this video. So this video is been produced by the Atlanta TMD Institute, and we are trying to make people healthy. This is my mission in life. I don't have to work. I go to work to help people, and I enjoy it. It's amazing. And I see amazing things every single day. But then I look out in the world, and the world is polluted with people grasping on to money, people hurting other people, thinking of themselves. The world is a crazy, crazy place. It really is. So we have to change the world individually. Change yourself first, then change others. And that's very important. And this topic relates to head, neck, facial pain. And headache is probably and backache are the most common complaints that people have. And a lot of those will just be eliminated with taking note of the diet that you're eating and making simple changes in your life. So thank you for watching the video again. And if you know anybody that has a TMD problem, refer them to this or refer them to the Atlanta TMD Institute. That's what we do. That's what we love doing. And thank you so much.